4 signs that God is guiding your steps. Sign 1. The inner voice. In the silence of the soul, we often hear a gentle voice that guides us. It's that intuition that prevents us from making hasty decisions and leads us on safe paths. God speaks through this inner voice, whispering words of wisdom and encouragement. Just as Samuel heard the Lord's call during the night, we too can hear his voice in the depths of our hearts. When we feel peace in following this guidance, we know that God is directing our steps. Sign 2. Providential Circumstances. The circumstances of life, no matter how random they may seem, are often orchestrated by God. He opens doors where there is no way and closes those that would divert us from his purpose. When everything seems to fit together perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle, we recognize God's hand at work. Joseph, sold as a slave, became the governor of Egypt thanks to divine providence. God uses circumstances to guide and protect us. Sign 3. Wise Counsel. The advice of wise and God-fearing people is another sign that he is guiding us. God places individuals in our path who, with their words and experiences, show us the right direction. Just as Jethro advised Moses on how to lead the people of Israel, we too can receive guidance through godly counselors. When we seek and heed this advice, we are allowing God to lead. Sign 4. Peace that surpasses all understanding. Peace that surpasses all understanding is one of the clearest signs that we are following God's direction. Even in the midst of life's storms, this inner peace confirms that we are on the right path. It is the same peace that Jesus promised to his disciples, one that the world cannot give. When we are in tune with God's will, this peace envelops and strengthens us. It is an unmistakable sign of his guidance. Hearing God's voice. To hear God's voice, we need to silence the distractions around us. Seeking moments of solitude and prayer allows us to tune into the divine. The Bible teaches us that God speaks in various ways, whether through scripture, creation, or our conscience. The story of Elijah on Mount Horeb reminds us that God is not in the strong wind, nor in the earthquake, but in the gentle breeze. Learning to recognize this voice is essential to following his direction. Providence in action. In his infinite wisdom, God uses circumstances to shape our path. He turns evil into good, as he did with Joseph in Egypt. When we look back and see how he has guided our steps, our faith is strengthened. Even in adversity, we can trust that God is in control, orchestrating every detail for our good. Recognizing God's providence gives us hope and courage to move forward. Seeking godly counsel. The Bible exhorts us to seek wise counsel and not rely solely on our own understanding. Solomon, in all his wisdom, reminded us that in the multitude of counselors there is safety. God uses people around us to advise and guide us. By listening to this counsel with humility and discernment, we allow God to direct our steps. It is an act of faith and obedience to trust in the collective wisdom of the saints. The peace that guides. When we are in the center of God's will, we experience a peace that transcends circumstances. This peace is a sign that we are on the right path, regardless of the challenges we face. Paul taught us to pray and trust in God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard our hearts and minds. The presence of this peace in our lives is proof God is with us, guiding every step. The importance of solitude. Solitude is a sacred time where we can hear God's voice without distraction. Jesus often withdrew to solitary places to pray and be in communion with the Father. Following this example helps us discern God's will for our lives. In solitude, we find clarity and direction, allowing God to illuminate our path. It is a moment of spiritual renewal and insight, and alignment with divine purposes. Testimonies of faith. Testimonies of other believers can encourage us and confirm God's direction in our lives. Hearing how God has guided and blessed others strengthens our faith. The story of Ruth, who followed her mother-in-law Naomi and found favor in the eyes of Boaz, is an inspiring example of how God guides through relationships and circumstance. Sharing and listening to testimonies reminds us that God is always present and active in our lives, trusting in divine providence. Trusting in divine providence means believing that God has a perfect plan for us. Even when we do not understand the paths he leads us on, we can trust that he knows what is best. Jeremiah reminds us that God has plans for peace and not for harm. Give us a future and a hope. This trust allows us to rest and move forward in faith, knowing that we are in the hands of a loving and sovereign God. The wisdom of the elders. The elders of the faith have a wealth of experience and wisdom to share. They have walked with God for many years and have seen His faithfulness in various situations. Listening to their stories and advice can help us discern God's direction for our lives. Just as Timothy learned from Paul, we can learn from the elders that God places in our path. Their wisdom is a gift that helps us navigate peace as a guide. The peace of God is a sure guide in the midst of uncertainty. When facing difficult decisions, the presence or absence of this peace can help us discern God's will. Jesus promised to leave us His peace, and this promise gives us security. Following this peace is trusting that God is directing our steps, even when the path seems uncertain. It is a sign of His constant and loving presence in our lives. Solitude and prayer. Practice of solitude and prayer brings us closer to God and helps us hear His voice. Jesus taught us to seek the Father in secret, and there we find direction and comfort. Prayer is a continuous dialogue with God, where we can pour out our hearts and hear His response. In the quietness of prayer, God reveals His plans and guides us with His infinite wisdom. It is a time of spiritual renewal and strengthening. Inspiring testimonies. The testimonies of the saints are powerful reminders that God is actively guiding His people. Each story of victory and divine provision inspires us to trust more fully in God. The story of Abraham, who followed God's voice to an unknown land, is an example of faith and obedience. By sharing and listening to testimonies, we are encouraged to follow God's direction with confidence and courage. Providence in small things. God is present in the details of our daily lives, guiding us in both small and large decisions. He cares for us as a shepherd cares for his sheep, leading us to green pastures and still waters. Recognizing His hand in the small things helps us trust Him more in the big decision. The story of how Rebekah was chosen as Isaac's wife shows how God is involved in all aspects of our lives. It is a reminder that He is always caring for us. Wisdom in counsel. Seeking counsel from God-fearing people is a wise and biblical practice. Through this counsel, God reveals His will and direction. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, wrote extensively about the importance of wise counsel. By listening to and applying this counsel, we allow God to guide our steps. It is an act of humility and faith to recognize that we need the wisdom of others to make sound decisions.